What is the condition of free speech in America today? I'm Sanford Unger, Director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University, and on this series, Speaking Freely, we talk from time to time with thought leaders and other players in the free speech drama unfolding in America. Today, Aaron Hanlon, a professor of English at Colby College in Maine. Aaron Hanlon, you are a young tenure-track assistant professor of English at a small liberal arts college in New England, Colby College, and you have become controversial for some of your views. So how did you escape anonymity and make yourself controversial in this debate over free speech?
I mean, I never really thought there's any possibility. I shouldn't say possibility. I never thought I would be controversial for saying the things that I've said about free speech, because I've always been a very interested, active proponent of the First Amendment.
Right.
And on multiple parts of the political spectrum, multiple ends of the political spectrum. So I thought when I was making an argument for the quality of speech as a way of valuing speech.
The quality rather than the official point of view that it was expressing.
Precisely. And I didn't think that making an argument for the quality of speech, for improved quality of speech, would be as controversial. Yeah.
So explain how it became controversial.
I think it's because...
what is your view that is controversial?
The view that I have that's controversial is that institutions of higher education have multiple duties to their educational mission and to the students and to the faculty that are sometimes in conflict with an absolutist position on free speech on campus. And so there are limits to what an institution of higher education might want to encourage and give a platform to on campus. And those limits are not, in my view, to be set according to political litmus test. It's
Right.
not about left and right.
Not content-directed limits.
Correct.
Right. But what are those limits? How would you define them?
Well, part of the difficulty with my position, and partially part of the controversy, is that it's extraordinarily difficult to, formulaically set these limits. So my position is more about the process by which we come to invite a speaker or have an event on campus, that we should be talking to each other across the political aisle before we go and make invitations, and stop using the invitation for a speaker as a weapon to punish the other side or
Right.
to make the other side offended.
So this is a novel view that the dialogue or any constructive conflict should go on before the speaker is even invited, rather than after someone's invited and becomes a lightning rod and a litmus test for what the campus believes.
Right, I think we would have fewer instances of speech controversy if we simply got together and talked a little bit about it before we did these things,
Right.
and we included more voices on parts of the campus community.
Sure. So
before we made these invitations.
sketch out for me just how that would take place. What would happen? You'd have
So right now, what usually happens is a handful of students, as is their right and their prerogative, choose to invite a speaker that they know is going to headline and they know is going to antagonize the other side. These are usually, what I would call far-right speakers.
Right.
And
we can name names. I mean, you're talking
Milo Yiannopoulos,
Right.
Ann Coulter,
Right.
Richard Spencer to an extent
Right.
as well. And I think what ought to happen instead is that these student clubs should get together and think about what would create a really good political dialogue. Which speakers could we bring that would respect everybody and challenge everybody intellectually without basically, and let's, by the way, bring speakers who might not have a platform, who might actually add something new to the conversation that we
When you
can't
say
watch
might
YouTube
not have a
videos.
platform, what do you mean?
Somebody who doesn't have a vast media reach, whose views on all of these issues you couldn't find on YouTube in multiple videos,
Right. So
prominently displayed everywhere.
Right, so some of the people you're talking about, for example, Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter, are it's widely known what they think in advance.
Yes.
And there's been disruption around their speeches in other places. And so it's kind of like bringing a show to town that you already know tends to provoke
It's exactly
uproar.
It's exactly that, and furthermore, the very reason that it tends to provoke uproar is the motivation to bring this kind of speaker, right? It's explicitly not to further any kind of intellectual or policy-oriented or philosophical discussion
Right.
about the First Amendment or any other kind of policy.
And so, I mean, it actually sort of, I grew up in a small town. When I was a young child, we still had vaudeville coming to our town. And so you didn't go to a vaudeville show on a Saturday afternoon because there were going to be any real surprises. You knew what to expect. They'd been in some other town a week earlier or something. And so this sort of is more reminiscent of vaudeville than of intellectual enterprise.
I think that's an apt comparison, and I think it would be interesting to ask what these events would have looked like if they were always from the beginning staged as comedy shows, performances in the performing arts centers, right? I mean, what would that context have done to these discussions about the First Amendment? Because I don't think anybody, myself included, would want to say, oh, that piece of theater, that comedy act is not appropriate.
Right, right.
In that guise or in that context.
So, whom would you invite, or who would be on your list rather than these well-known people whose appearance results in disruption and sometimes violence even?
I mean, there are. I take very seriously the need to have more right of center and conservative speakers represented, voices in general represented on campuses, right, in the U.S. So Yuval Levin, Walter Williams.
Explain who they are.
I think Levin is at Hoover, if I'm not mistaken.
The Hoover Institution, which is a conservative think tank in Palo Alto, California.
Right, and Williams has been at George Mason, an economist, for example.
Mason University in the D.C. area, and has a very conservative economics department, among others.
Right. And so these are the types of voices who I don't think anybody would accuse of being conservative in name only, right? They have conservative policy positions. They're proven. They have a proven track record of engaging constructively with the other side, and in these types of scenarios.
So they are among people, and there are probably many more who are interested in intellectual dialogue.
Right, and it shouldn't. As I'm a by no means the far leftist that people will sometimes say I am, but I'm left of center, and I think sometimes to myself that it's a shame that I'm the one who has to go around and talk about who the best conservative speaker should be, right? Because if I were a conservative student, as I used to be, if I were a conservative student now, I would be scouring for these people, scouring the internet and trying to find who these really smart people are.
And ironically, these people you're talking about would probably cost less to bring.
Yes.
Because they don't have the high price tag that some of the more flamboyant disruptive speakers might have.
Yes, and pressure on resources is a major issue in higher education right now. And so if you imagine how many conservative speakers could one bring for the cost of one Ann Coulter?
Good point.
You could have a whole series for a whole year right, of conservative speakers for the cost of one of these headlining provocateurs.
That's probably true. So how does one advance this rather calm proposal of yours? How do you get people to buy into what you're saying, convince people that conservatives, they're conservative students, and there are many legitimately conservative students. How do you convince them they're not being victimized by this change of process and personnel, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things as a professor that I do is I make sure to be in dialogue with my conservative students and to advocate for them when they need somebody to advocate for them, to listen to them during office hours, to talk policy with them, to play devil's advocate in the classroom against if there's a dominant, left position in the classroom, to try and counterbalance that, even if it's not what I believe in. And I think that goes a long way, because these are the people who are going to be inviting the speakers. These are the people who are going to be going out into the world and doing their thing and promoting their views and their values.
How did we arrive in a situation where students come to college, whether it's in a large university or a small liberal arts college like where you're teaching, with these established positions? I mean, how many conservative students, how many liberal students do you have, and how do you measure that before they've even gotten there, or when they've barely arrived?
There's a really good, UCLA does a first-year survey, a pretty comprehensive survey of political views among other attitudes for incoming first-year students, and finds that students are increasingly liberal entering college. So I can understand why there's some anxiety about that.
Anxiety among students who don't identify themselves.
Correct. Because that situation I think, would make a conservative student feel a little bit lost. So that's something to keep an eye on. But the flip side of that is that colleges actually, from everything that I've seen, and I think this is a good ongoing question to investigate empirically, colleges tend to have a positive effect on students' attitudes toward free speech and hearing out offensive viewpoints, right? So even if they're entering liberal, they are being, I think, educated in a way that makes them more receptive to multiple points of view by the time they're through college.
Now, that runs against another stereotype, because surveys have repeatedly shown that students think it's more important to that the failure that preventing their peers from being insulted is more important than encouraging free speech. This is what some of the surveys say. And a lot of people are wringing their hands over this notion that young students don't believe in free speech as a paramount value anymore.
I think this is partly it's a generational argument. The millennials data tends to suggest that millennials are more in favor of free speech and less likely than other populations and many other populations to want to suppress offensive speech. But there is, and Heterodox Academy is a consortium of professors dedicated to viewpoint diversity on campuses. And Jonathan Haidt and a colleague there have done studies that looked at the data for a more recent group, so not just millennials, but a sort of slightly younger end of that spectrum, and found that those are the ones who are starting to report some of that survey data that you describe. And so that's something to keep an eye on.
The younger ones.
The younger ones, right.
Are turning against a purist view of free speech.
And not in sweeping ways, right? But possibly in certain areas.
Right.
Racist speech, for example, or speech perceived as racist speech, is something that's wildly unpopular among young people.
Right.
We could ask if that's a good thing or
well,
not.
Yeah. I mean, if we have, it should somehow be possible to disfavor and show a negative attitude toward racist speech without suppressing free speech. It doesn't seem to me
Yes.
that these always have to be in juxtaposition to each other.
No, I agree. I think that's true. And on campus, the issue is sometimes what the pastoral duty is of the college or the university toward its students. In other words, what about issues of safety if racist speech becomes provocative to the point where it's attracting a lot of outside groups who are showing up looking for a fight. This happens on the left and it happens on the right.
Yes.
Then that's an issue that might, but outside of that, I think that's correct. We don't need to shut down racist speech as such. We need to be vocal about our opposition to it.
So here's a question. You know about the Heckler's veto and
Yes.
how it's disfavored in the law and,
Yes.
and by people who talk about these things. In other words, that speech can be suppressed, can be vetoed by people simply shouting it down and in effect vetoing the message by heckling the messenger. How do you evaluate that? What is the place of the Heckler's veto in this whole dialogue?
Great question. So generally speaking, I am wary of a situation where the heckler gets the last say and ends up being able to really modify, the viewpoints being expressed in any space. I'm going to do another counterintuitive thing. I'm going to say another counterintuitive thing, which is not mine, but it belongs largely to Jeremy Waldron at NYU Law. He has a working paper out, which actually makes a really clever argument for the heckler as a way of actually increasing free speech, and that argument is basically that so much of these speeches, of these talks, are so staged, and the audience is expected to just sit there and kind of listen and let this sort of stage performance play out uninterrupted in any way the speaker wants.
However it may offend them or insult them or whatever.
As well as however factually incorrect whatever is being said is. And so, Waldron makes this really clever argument that actually, there's a range of heckler responses. Some of them, if they absolutely silence the speaker and make it impossible for others to hear, would be a problem. But shouting out in the crowd, no, that's wrong, right? Or that's a lie, is something that actually enlivens the speech scenario and sort of represents a greater freedom of speech, and that's in that speaker-audience dynamic.
Well, and it seems to me that members of the audience who object to, disagree with, or offended by the speech have free speech rights too.
Absolutely. That's the part of the conversation that doesn't get expressed too often is precisely that. A lot of these protests are very much within the bounds of the First Amendment.
Right.
Some of them go too far and beyond that, but a lot of them really are, but we tend to lump all of them together and say, oh, they're all
Right.
against free speech
Right.
because they're protesting a speaker.
So there's a scenario that I think sometimes plays out where a racist, white supremacist speaker, anti-Semitic, anti-Latino, sort of white power kind of profile comes to speak someplace. And I wonder if the view of those who bring that, there's one person who's particularly known for this, you mentioned his name earlier, Richard Spencer, but there are others as well. Is the imagination of the people who bring someone like that, or often in the case of Spencer, no one's bringing him but himself, he's invited
Right.
himself.
Right.
But is the idea that people will sit there and say, oh yes, Mr. Spencer, what interesting ideas you're raising. You may invalidate my very existence, but I want to listen to you and ask you thoughtful, penetrating questions. It's just almost impossible to imagine such a scenario taking place.
Yeah, it seems pretty fatuous to me that that's what people envision would happen. And I think it's worth asking the question of ourselves, do we need to continually relitigate the idea of white supremacy, for example?
Well, we've rejected it as a society.
Right.
We've rejected our racist constitutional clause that
Yes.
said that. Court decisions, one after another, have rejected racism. Legislation at the federal, state, local level has rejected it. What's to talk about anymore?
Right, and this is the irony of this is that the marketplace of ideas model, which presupposes that bad ideas get subjected to the scrutiny of contestation and get thrown out, would seem to suggest that white supremacy as an idea has been subjected plenty of ways and for a long time to that scrutiny and ought to be not considered the type of argument that we want to have in a platform that has limited access and other types of missions. Right. I go to the public square by any means. Right. That's a right that should always be upheld. But if the Wall Street Journal editorial board doesn't want to hear the same Marxist argument every single year, every single month, and says, no, I'm not going to publish that, that seems quite reasonable to me. And I think we should apply the same type of logic to somebody like Richard Spencer. Right.
Well, nobody out in the real world, as it were, in the sort of world of respectable dialogue, nobody does publish Richard Spencer, or as far as I know.
Right. Yeah, I'm not aware of any.
So he publishes himself, and certain fringe publications do. And as you suggest, he has a right to publish himself, and those fringe publications have a right to do it.
Absolutely.
But I think what I hear you saying is that the argument sometimes takes place in the wrong spectrum, in the wrong place, because I guess if there are white supremacist ideas out there, people should be exposed to them enough so that they can deal with them and won't be surprised by them. But at the same time, this notion of showing those ideas respect and hearing them out and then asking probing questions, there are some things that are maybe beyond that condition.
Yeah, because there's a difference, an important difference between showing enough respect to an idea to listen and giving it institutional clout by providing a platform at an institution that has a role to play, a broader role to play in a society that people take very seriously. So I wonder what an answer to this might be fine, it's all fine, but I wonder what various university personnel would say about somebody like Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos putting on their resume that they gave a big speech at X university or X college. Yeah. How does that reflect on the institution?
Right. You had an experience with a television program with someone called Tucker Carlson on Fox News. Maybe you could tell me about that.
Well, it was actually going on the program was a lot of fun, I have to say, although that's maybe just my disposition. But immediately after walking out of the studio and getting the earpiece out and everything, my phone was just blowing up with all of these really hateful messages being intentionally, deliberately circulated and magnified by Fox and then the wider conservative media. And so it turned into weeks and weeks of basically just trying to protect myself from defamation in many ways.
Really?
Including having to monitor my old Georgetown University Rate My Professors page, where people were posing as students making claims that I was sexually inappropriate and things like that, and saying that they couldn't sit for the final because I creeped them out or something. And I looked, I looked at this and I said, I've never actually given a sit-down final in that class. It's a paper.
So there's something plausible here.
This is not somebody who's ever been in my class, but this is somebody who's trying to defame me in these ways. So that was really quite an ordeal.
How did you deal with that? How did you stop it?
Mostly, I learned to ignore a lot of it, because the more you push, the more you get fed back into the loop. and provoking, just provoking more of the same. I consulted a lawyer. I worked with Colby College, which has been just extraordinarily supportive in these matters, setting me at ease about how they will respond to anybody calling for me to be fired because the president got a ton of those calls. I'm very sorry to him for that. But
so what is it that you said, as you look back on it now? What did you say that provoked this unpleasant response?
I think what it mainly was I used the term value judgment to mean we should be able to, we should feel free to make judgments about the quality and the value of speech. That doesn't have to mean censoring speech ultimately, but it should mean prioritizing speech in certain ways, which is, I think, exactly what the marketplace of ideas model would suggest. But that term value judgment really struck a nerve with people, and it made people think that by value judgment I meant partisan political values, and that I was saying value judgment effectively just means I won't listen to conservative speakers, which is asinine. But I think I understand in some ways how people might have thought that's what I was saying if they hadn't read the article.
And what you really meant by that was?
A quality argument as opposed to a political spectrum argument, right? We should have high quality speakers on college campuses across the political spectrum.
And we would define quality by their willingness to entertain, disagree, contrary ideas or things like that.
Right, to respectfully engage in dialogue with students and faculty, entertain the gamut of ideas, right? And
entertain the gamut of ideas rather than be entertainers, which is in a way what they are.
It's a very good way of putting it, yeah.
In some cases.
Yeah.
And so has that settled down now?
Yes, for the most part, yes. And I've learned a few things from that. I'm a little bit more guarded on social media. I'm a little bit more careful about the terms that I use. That might be, when I pull them out of an academic context and throw them out there, sometimes they might not land in the way that I hoped. So I'm a little bit smarter about that.
And is it unusual that you're in an English department and you're in this role? I mean, one might expect somebody in a philosophy department or political philosophy department to...
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I do get a little bit of a strange look sometimes on panels with political scientists and economists and political philosophers, but I think it's great fun. And I study the 18th century and the Enlightenment, so the public sphere, the rise of journalism, civil rights, the Bill of Rights. I mean, these are all things that I, have been studying the history of very closely in my field of 18th century British literature. So for me, it's a kind of natural transition, but I think sometimes it doesn't always seem that way from the outside.
Right, so some people would say, student of obscure British literature is telling us what to do in this very complex era we're living in, and go back to your books and leave us alone. Go back to your books,
right. This is often one of the responses, right?
Right. Well, I for one hope you won't, and I appreciate your being with us today, Aaron, to talk about these ideas.
I'm so glad you had me. It was a great pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been talking with Professor Aaron Hanlon of Colby College in Maine about his unique views of the alleged free speech crisis on the American campus. To learn more about Georgetown University's Free Speech Project, visit our website. Thanks for watching. I'm Sanford Unger.